He thought he'd seen it all. Boardroom betrayals, corporate espionage, rivals clawing for his empire's throat. But nothing prepared him for the alien girl's whisper. She wasn't supposed to be real. Just a strange refugee with too many eyes and a voice like static over glass. Yet when she leaned close and hissed, "Someone's stealing from you," something in her tone cut through his doubts like a blade. The next morning, without proof, without hesitation, he fired every single member of his staff. Some called him paranoid, others called him insane. But deep down, he knew the girl wasn't lying. The first time he heard the alien girl speak, it wasn't in the booming authority of a commander or the sly persuasion of a politician, but in something far more intimate. A whisper that seemed to slip beneath the surface of his skin, crawling into his bones as if it belonged there. He had dismissed her at first, the way a man dismisses a shadow flickering in the corner of his vision, something his mind was not ready to confront. But when she leaned forward, her two bright eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the air itself feel brittle, the words she spoke clung to him with an unnatural weight. "Someone's stealing from you." It was not just a statement but a certainty, spoken with the calm finality of someone who had already seen the crime unfold. He found himself unable to laugh it off, unable to wave it away as a paranoia, or a trick designed to secure her own survival. For weeks he had sensed cracks in his empire, whispers of disloyalty, a slippage in profits that his best analysts chalked up to market fluctuations. Yet in the way she said it, there was no hesitation, no doubt, and that alone was enough to freeze the excuses in his throat. She was not supposed to matter. She had arrived in his orbit by accident, or so she claimed, rescued from a derelict vessel that drifted far too close to the asteroid refinery his company owned. He should have handed her over to the authorities, should have let her vanish into the labyrinth of bureaucracies that processed alien refugees with cold efficiency. But something about her presence kept him from letting go. She carried herself with a strange blend of fragility and ferocity, like porcelain threaded with steel, and though her body bore the marks of travel and hunger, her eyes, too large, too luminous, always seemed to see more than they should. She would sit in silence for hours, watching as though she were peeling back the layers of every person around her, dissecting lies and motives without lifting a finger. When she finally chose to speak, it was never idle chatter. Every word she uttered was deliberate, as though she rationed language the way a dying man rations breath. And now here she was, telling him what he had already feared but dared not admit aloud. The thought of betrayal wasn't new. After all, the higher he climbed, the more knives he expected at his back. But the way she said it made the ground feel unstable, as though his empire was already collapsing beneath his feet, and he was only just realizing it. He tried to push her for details, but she gave none. No names, no evidence, no explanations, just the warning, spoken with the conviction of a truth already proven. It was infuriating and terrifying all at once. His instinct told him to demand answers, to corner her until she gave him more, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the calmness in her gaze, or the faint tremor in her voice that suggested she was risking more than he understood by even telling him this much. Her presence forced him to replay the recent weeks in his mind, tracing the thin threads of doubt that had begun to weave through his business. Small discrepancies in the shipping manifests, resources disappearing from storage without any trail, teams of workers suddenly taking sick days in unison. At first he had chalked it all up to human error, the chaos of managing an operation stretched across multiple worlds, but she had shattered the comfort of those explanations. Someone was stealing from him, not a rival in the open, not a competitor under the spotlight of market battles, but someone inside, someone close enough to carve out pieces of his fortune and spirit them away unseen. The worst part was the possibility that it wasn't just money being stolen, but secrets, plans, patents, designs that could cripple his company if they fell into the wrong hands. And if that was true, then every man and woman in his employment became a suspect. He watched her carefully, searching for a hint of deceit. It wouldn't be the first time someone tried to manipulate him through fear. Yet what he saw in her expression wasn't manipulation but urgency, a raw kind of desperation, as if she needed him to act before it was too late. He wondered if her species had some kind of advantage, a sense beyond human comprehension. There were rumors, unconfirmed and ridiculed in most circles, that some aliens could read emotional currents like others read financial reports. If she was one of them, if her people could pierce the veil of human lies, then her warning wasn't guesswork, it was fact. That possibility lodged itself into his mind like a splinter he couldn't dig out. The night stretched on around him, his office glowing with the sterile blue of data screens that suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of her words. He had always prided himself on being the master of information, the one who controlled the flow of knowledge, yet here was a being from another world undermining all his systems with a single sentence. His empire, which had taken decades to build, no longer felt invincible. The alien girl sat across from him in silence, watching him wrestle with the storm she had unleashed, her gaze unwavering. She did not comfort him, did not reassure him, because perhaps she knew those gestures would ring hollow. Instead, she simply allowed him to feel the weight of her truth, and it was heavier than anything he had ever carried before. He thought of his staff, the executives, the advisors, the managers, the workers who had sworn loyalty to him. They had stood beside him in boardrooms, toasted victories at galas, pledged their trust with smiles and handshakes, but loyalty was a fragile thing, and he had seen enough of human ambition to know how quickly it could wither when tempted by profit or power. If someone was stealing, then betrayal had already taken root among them. The question was not if, but how deep it ran. Every face he had once trusted now flickered in his mind like a mask concealing treachery. Her words had poisoned the well of his certainty, and he would never drink from it the same way again. The warning echoed through him long after the sound of her voice faded. It settled into his mind with the cold permanence of stone, a reminder that his empire was not as unshakable as he believed. He tried to imagine the scale of the theft, the damage already done, and whether it was too late to stop it. He wondered if she had seen more than she let on, if her warning was only the surface of a much deeper fracture running through his life. For the first time in years, he felt the unfamiliar sting of vulnerability, as though the walls he had built around himself were paper-thin against forces he did not yet understand. The decision came to him in the dead of night, when silence pressed against the walls of his office, and every light in the skyscraper had dimmed but his own. He sat there surrounded by screens full of numbers, projections and reports that suddenly looked like meaningless hieroglyphs. The alien girl's words gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, repeating over and over until they became a drumbeat that drowned out reason. Someone was stealing from him. He had built this empire with his own blood and cunning, clawing his way up from obscurity into the rarefied air where fortunes were made and dynasties forged. And now, with one whispered warning, it felt as though everything he had worked for was hanging by a thread. He could not risk hesitation. He could not risk mercy. If betrayal was already inside his walls, then no one could be trusted. Not his advisors, not his managers, not even the assistants who had followed him for years. If rot had set in, then the only way forward was to burn out the infection entirely. He did not make the decision out of impulse alone. It came with the weight of every suspicious glance he had ignored, every irregularity buried under spreadsheets, every smile that had seemed just a little too practiced. The more he thought of it, the clearer it became. Loyalty had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The girl had not given him names, but perhaps that was the point. By keeping it vague, she forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that any of them could be guilty, and if he could not tell who the traitor was, then he had no choice but to treat them all as such. It was a brutal logic, the kind that had carried him through boardroom wars and hostile takeovers. Ruthless decisions were the bones of his empire, and this would be no different. By sunrise, he had already drafted the orders. When the message went out, the shockwaves rippled through the company like an earthquake. Entire departments froze as their access codes were revoked. Executives who had spent decades climbing the hierarchy found themselves locked out of systems and escorted from their offices without warning. The Human Resources Division, ironically, was among the first to be dismantled, its own staff blindsided by the mass dismissal notices they themselves had to send. It wasn't just a few terminations here and there. It was everyone. Every single employee, from the boardroom strategists down to the custodians who cleaned the marble floors at night, was informed that their services were no longer required. The announcement hit like a thunderclap, leaving confusion, anger, and disbelief in its wake. Some begged for explanations, flooding his private channels with desperate appeals. They reminded him of their loyalty, of the years they had given, of the sacrifices they had made for the company's success. They wanted reasons, something they could understand, but he gave them none. Silence was the only answer he offered, because he knew that words would not ease the sting of betrayal. Others reacted with rage, threatening lawsuits, demanding justice, calling him paranoid and unhinged. Their voices rose like a chorus of fury, but he let them scream into the void. The more they shouted, the more certain he became that he had made the right choice. If they could so quickly turn on him when cast aside, then perhaps their loyalty had never been genuine to begin with. The media was relentless, seizing on the story within hours. Headlines branded him a tyrant, a madman, a reckless billionaire consumed by paranoia. Analysts speculated on the collapse of his empire, predicting chaos in the markets and vultures circling to strip his assets bare. News anchors smirked as they debated whether this was the end of his reign, while rival corporations quietly celebrated what they believed to be his downfall. Yet behind closed doors, whispers spread among those who knew him best, whispers that perhaps he had uncovered something deeper, something dangerous, that the rest of the world couldn't yet see. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but the speed and severity of his decision suggested he had knowledge they didn't, and in a world where secrets were more valuable than currency, that possibility was enough to breed unease. The halls of his headquarters became a graveyard of empty offices, glass doors standing ajar, personal belongings abandoned in the haste of forced exits. Entire floors went dark, their once bustling activity silenced overnight. Security swept through the building with mechanical precision, ensuring that no one lingered longer than they were allowed. Within a day, the empire he had built was gutted, its workforce dismantled in one sweeping gesture. He walked those empty corridors alone, his footsteps echoing like accusations, and felt the eerie weight of what he had done. There was no going back now. The trust that had once bound him to his staff was severed completely, and in its place lay only suspicion and silence. Yet beneath the chaos, a grim clarity began to form. By wiping the slate clean, he had created an environment where betrayal could no longer hide in the shadows. With no staff left to protect, no inner circle to shield him, he could begin again on his own terms. Whoever had been stealing from him, whoever had dared to undermine his power, had now been cast adrift with the rest, and in that exile they might reveal themselves. He knew desperation had a way of stripping people of their masks, and when it did, he would be watching. The alien girl's warning had not just unsettled him, it had reshaped the entire structure of his empire. It was a gamble of terrifying magnitude, but gambles had always been his way of bending fate to his will. As the sun rose, painting the skyline in shades of fire and steel, he stood by the vast window of his office and looked down at the city below. From here it all still looked the same, towers gleaming, traffic pulsing, commerce humming along. But he knew the truth. His world had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Behind him, the alien girl remained silent, watching with those unblinking eyes that seemed to see past appearances into the marrow of things. He did not ask her if he had done the right thing. He did not seek her approval. Deep down, he understood that the path he had chosen was not about right or wrong, but about survival, and survival had always demanded sacrifice. The staff who had once been the backbone of his empire were gone, erased in a single day, and all that remained was him, the alien girl, and the gnawing certainty that something greater was yet to come. The aftermath of the purge settled like dust after an explosion, and in that silence the cracks began to reveal themselves. At first it was in the numbers, anomalies buried in the layers of financial reports that suddenly looked different without the camouflage of daily operations. Lines that had seemed balanced now bent under scrutiny. Figures that once aligned neatly began to fracture when compared against hard records. He spent long nights alone with the data, combing through transaction after transaction, and each time he dug deeper the evidence piled higher. Resources had been disappearing for months, quietly siphoned away under the guise of legitimate shipments. Materials marked as delivered to outposts had never arrived. Fuel consignments supposedly burned in transit were missing entirely, and the profits that had been reported as steady were nothing more than illusions maintained by false entries and clever manipulation. The empire he had trusted to run smoothly under his staff's supervision was riddled with sabotage, like a vessel slowly filling with water while its crew smiled and told him the voyage was calm. The betrayal was sharper now, no longer a vague fear whispered by the alien girl, but a tangible reality written in cold numbers and falsified documents. Every discovery tightened the coil in his chest. These were not small thefts, not desperate acts of underpaid employees looking to scrape by. This was organized, methodical, precise, as if someone had designed an entire network dedicated to bleeding him dry. The sums involved were staggering, and the scope suggested inside knowledge at the highest levels of his organization. Whole departments had been complicit, or at the very least asleep at their posts, and the realization burned in him like acid. He had trusted them with his legacy, and they had sold pieces of it to ghosts he could not yet see. Beyond the money, stranger patterns began to emerge. Certain shipments did not just vanish, they reappeared under false identities in markets where his competitors thrived. Patents he had kept under lock and key, designs still in their infancy, surfaced in prototypes unveiled by rival corporations months ahead of schedule. Sabotage was not limited to theft of resources, but extended into intellectual espionage, the kind of treachery that could collapse not just profits but reputation. He traced the threads of these leaks across different sectors, and realized that this was not the work of a single trader, but a web, a lattice of betrayal woven into every corner of his empire. The scale of it was staggering, so immense that he wondered how long it had been happening without his knowledge. The alien girl had not been exaggerating. If anything, her warning had barely scratched the surface of what was unfolding beneath him. In the quiet of his empty headquarters, the truth seemed to echo louder than any voice. He replayed the faces of his former staff in his mind, wondering who among them had orchestrated the scheme and who had simply looked the other way. Every smile, every handshake, every word of loyalty now felt hollow, like the masks of actors in a play staged for his benefit, while the real performance happened in the shadows. The thought enraged him, but it also filled him with an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. If so much could happen under his nose, what else had he missed? What other secrets had slipped past him while he believed himself untouchable? For a man who had built his identity on control, the realization that he had been deceived so thoroughly was like a knife twisting in his pride. The alien girl offered no comfort, no explanation, but her presence lingered like a reminder that he was not entirely blind. On more than one occasion, he caught her watching him sift through the wreckage of his records, her luminous eyes scanning the data, as if she could see something in the patterns that escaped him. When he asked if she knew more than she had said, she only tilted her head, as if the answer was not one he was ready to hear. Her silence was maddening, but it also sharpened his resolve. If she had seen something in the fabric of his empire that even he had missed, then she was valuable beyond measure, and if her instincts had proven right once, he had to trust they would guide him again.
As the scope of the sabotage revealed itself, the paranoia he had once tried to suppress became his constant companion. He began to question not just his staff but his allies, his partners, even the institutions that had stood beside him for years. Contracts were re-examined, alliances reconsidered, friendships re-evaluated under the harsh light of betrayal. He began to suspect that the rot in his empire was not confined to those he had fired but extended outward, into the networks that connected his company to the wider world. Rivals who had prospered at his expense suddenly seemed too fortunate, their successes too conveniently timed. He wondered if foreign hands, perhaps even alien factions, had reached into his affairs and turned his own people against him. The thought was chilling, but in the face of the evidence, he could no longer dismiss it. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that the thefts were not simply about profit. The selection of what had been stolen suggested strategy, as though someone was carefully dismantling his foundation piece by piece. Critical technologies, rare materials essential for advanced development, logistical systems that ensured efficiency across his network. All of these had been targeted, stripped away and redirected elsewhere. Whoever orchestrated it was not just robbing him, they were preparing to replace him. It was as if an invisible hand was constructing a mirror image of his empire somewhere in the shadows, built on the bones of what they had stolen from him. That thought more than any other filled him with a cold rage. It was not enough for his enemies to weaken him. They wanted to supplant him entirely, to take what he had created and claim it as their own. Each new revelation drove him further into isolation. He no longer sought advice, no longer trusted the counsel of anyone who had once stood in his circle. His world became a fortress of locked doors and encrypted files, a labyrinth only he could navigate. Sleep became a rare indulgence, replaced by endless hours of investigation, each discovery feeding his obsession. The alien girl remained his only constant, her presence both unsettling and oddly grounding, as though she was the tether keeping him from unraveling completely. She never interfered, never told him to stop, but her silence seemed to carry a weight of its own, as though she knew this was a journey he had to walk alone. In the end, the sabotage was no longer just a problem to be solved. It became a war declared against him, an unseen battle fought in the shadows of numbers, contracts, and stolen designs. He could feel the shape of his enemy forming even if he could not yet see their face. And though his empire had been gutted and his trust shattered, he felt a dangerous clarity growing in the ruins. The thefts had exposed the weaknesses in his foundation, weaknesses he now understood could never be ignored again. If someone thought they could dismantle him quietly, piece by piece, they had underestimated him gravely. For all the betrayal, for all the sabotage, there was one truth that remained unshaken. He had not reached this height by being weak, and he would not fall without striking back with a force they could not anticipate.
It was in the quiet moments, when the data screens dimmed and the echo of his own footsteps in the hollow building faded, that he finally confronted the question of how she had known. The alien girl had arrived with nothing but the tattered remnants of her clothing and a haunted look in her eyes. Yet she had seen through the facade of his empire with a single sentence. He had spent decades building systems of control, surrounding himself with analysts, auditors, and specialists whose sole purpose was to detect deceit, and all of them had failed. She had spoken once, and the entire illusion crumbled. He began to watch her more closely, not just with the eyes of a man grateful for a warning, but with the calculation of someone trying to understand a mystery too dangerous to leave unsolved. Her gaze unsettled him most. When she looked at him, it wasn't like other people did. Humans looked at faces, at expressions, at the details that hinted at emotions. She seemed to look through those things, past the surface, into something deeper and less tangible. It was as if she could strip away the armor of practiced smiles and polished words and see the raw truth hidden beneath. At first he dismissed it as intuition, the kind of sharp perception born from hardship and survival. Many refugees carried that skill, the ability to read danger in a glance or sense betrayal before it happened. But the more time he spent with her, the less he believed it was simply instinct. Too many times, she spoke with certainty where others hesitated. Too many times, her observations cut directly to the heart of a matter without the need for evidence. When he questioned her about it, she would deflect, turning the conversation aside with vague words or silence. But her silence was never ignorance. It was the silence of someone holding knowledge they were unwilling, or perhaps unable to share. That silence gnawed at him more than words ever could. He began testing her, almost without realizing it. He would bring up names of people he once trusted, watching her expression carefully, waiting for a flicker of reaction. He would mention business deals, some real, some fabricated, to see if her eyes betrayed anything. And each time, though she said nothing, he noticed subtle shifts, the tightening of her jaw, the way her gaze lingered or slipped away. She wasn't reading the details he presented, she was reading him. She seemed to sense when he was lying, when he doubted himself, when he pressed too hard. It was not just dishonesty in others she perceived, but the fractures of truth within him as well. That realization chilled him, because it meant she could see him more clearly than anyone ever had. And for a man who had built his empire on secrecy, strategy, and manipulation, the thought of being so transparent was as terrifying as it was intoxicating. Whispers about her kind drifted in the outer edges of human knowledge, the kind of stories repeated in low voices at bars on frontier stations, dismissed in official records as rumor. There were tales of alien species whose senses extended beyond the 5 humans knew. Creatures who could feel emotional currents as if they were sound waves, who could taste lies on the air the way others tasted bitterness on the tongue. Most dismissed these stories as superstition, exaggerations born of fear and cultural misunderstanding. But sitting across from her, watching the way she studied him and others with unblinking precision, he could no longer dismiss them. If she carried such an ability, it explained everything. Her warning had not been a guess, not a suspicion, but the simple recognition of deception woven through the people around him. She had seen the dishonesty like a crack in glass, so obvious to her that she could not imagine how he had missed it. The thought that she could sense lies forced him to reassess everything between them. He wondered how much she already knew about him, about the compromises he had made, the deals struck in shadows, the betrayals he himself had committed on his climb to power. Did she see his empire as nothing more than a house of lies, held together by the same deceit she had warned him against? Did she judge him as harshly as she judged those who had stolen from him? He wanted to ask, but every time the question rose to his lips he swallowed it. Some truths were too dangerous to confront, even from her. And yet, despite the fear, he found himself unable to turn away. Her presence had become an anchor in the chaos, a reminder that while his systems had failed, there was still one source of certainty left, even if that certainty came from a being he did not fully understand. Others would see her as a threat, he knew. If the ability to detect dishonesty was real, then it was a weapon more powerful than any ledger or surveillance network. Entire governments would pay fortunes to possess it, to wield it against allies and enemies alike. Corporations would dissect her gift, seeking to reproduce it in machines, to strip it from her and turn it into a tool. The fact that she was here with him made her not only a mystery but a liability. He began to wonder if her warning had been a gift or a burden, because the more he understood, the more dangerous her presence became. He had always thrived on control, and yet she was a variable he could not manipulate, an equation he could not solve. The possibility of losing her, or worse, of others discovering what she could do, pressed heavily on him. Despite that, he could not deny the trust that had begun to grow between them, fragile though it was. She did not seek to exploit him, at least not in any way he could see. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, and yet gave him more than any of his trusted advisors ever had: the truth. He found himself relying on her in subtle ways, glancing at her when doubts arose, gauging her silence more than the words of those who once surrounded him. It was an uneasy alliance, but one he could not afford to ignore. The more he uncovered about the theft and sabotage in his empire, the clearer it became that she had been right all along, and each confirmation of her warning bound him closer to her in ways he had not expected. Late one evening, as he studied yet another falsified report, he asked her outright how she had known. For a long time she did not answer, her gaze fixed on the glowing screen in front of him. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost reluctant. She told him she did not see lies the way humans imagined, as obvious signs or gestures, but felt them ripples in the air, distortions in the fabric of intent. To her, dishonesty carried a weight, a discordant note that disturbed the harmony of truth around it. She could no more ignore it than he could ignore the sound of shattering glass. She said it was not a gift but a burden, because once you saw the cracks, you could never unsee them. Lies became louder than words, betrayal brighter than loyalty, and the world was never silent again. He listened, absorbing her explanation, and though he wanted to ask more, he sensed the pain in her tone, the exhaustion of carrying such knowledge. For once he held his tongue, realizing that pressing her further would only deepen the wound. From that night on, he no longer doubted her. Whatever her species had given her, whatever curse or gift it was real, and it had saved him from a downfall he might never have seen until it was too late. She was no longer just a refugee, no longer just a mystery to be solved. She had become the only compass he could trust in a world where deception had hollowed out everything he thought was secure. And though he did not admit it aloud, even to himself, he knew that without her, the empire he was trying to rebuild from the ashes would not stand for long. The revelations had not stopped with the discovery of theft, or the strange certainty the alien girl carried with her. What followed was the creeping realization that the forces arrayed against him were not confined to the walls of his own empire. Rivals who had long hovered at the edges of his markets, competitors who smiled with practiced charm while sharpening their knives in secret, were now moving more boldly than ever. He could see their fingerprints in the stolen patents and mirrored designs, their shadow in the sudden leaks of information that had once been locked away in vaults of encrypted code. What unsettled him most was the speed with which they acted, as if they had been waiting all along for the moment when his defenses faltered. His purge of staff, shocking as it was, had given them the excuse they needed to advance, circling like predators around wounded prey. But it wasn't only corporations hungry for his downfall, it was governments as well, watching carefully, calculating whether this was the moment to insert themselves into the vacuum of power. Rumors began to spread through channels he had cultivated for years, whispers of officials meeting with his competitors, of new contracts drafted with suspicious haste, of laws being considered that would restrict his reach under the guise of regulation. He had always known that his success painted a target on his back, but now the arrows were notched and ready to fly. And yet what disturbed him most was not the predictable aggression of human rivals, but the quiet pressure from beyond. Alien delegations, some he had never heard of before, appeared at the edges of trade networks with sudden interest in technologies eerily similar to his own. It was as if the sabotage of his empire had not only fed his competitors, but had fueled foreign factions eager to carve out their share of human ingenuity. The theft was not merely an act of betrayal, but a weapon in a larger game, one that reached across species and borders. The alien girl seemed to sense this before he did. She would sit in silence as news feeds reported on the latest moves by his enemies, her expression calm but her eyes fixed as if she were tracing a pattern invisible to him. When he pressed her for answers, she offered little, only quiet warnings that the forces aligned against him were not limited to what he could see. She spoke of currents beneath the surface, of motives layered within motives, and though her words were vague, they rang with a truth he could not dismiss. He began to suspect that her people, wherever they had come from, understood the kind of hidden games being played on scales larger than humanity had yet mastered. If she had warned him of betrayal within, then perhaps this too was another warning, one he had to heed before the storm broke fully over him. The political pressures grew more intense with every passing day. Allies who had once stood firmly beside him began to distance themselves, fearful of being dragged down by association with his crumbling empire. Board members who had once praised his vision now appeared on broadcast condemning his decisions, claiming ignorance of the thefts that had happened under their watch. Deals that had seemed secure were abruptly canceled, contracts withdrawn with vague excuses about shifting priorities. Everywhere he turned, he saw walls closing in, and behind those walls he saw the gleam of opportunists waiting to claim the spoils. It was a siege, not with armies and weapons, but with influence, with laws, with the careful manipulation of markets and perception, and it was working. His empire had not yet collapsed, but the pressure was mounting, and he could feel the cracks spreading wider. Yet he was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. The very forces aligned against him fueled his resolve. If rival corporations believed they could steal his designs and replicate his brilliance, then he would show them the difference between imitation and innovation. If governments thought they could cripple him with laws, then he would turn their own bureaucracy into a weapon against them. If alien factions wanted to profit from his downfall, then he would make them understand that humanity was not so easily undermined. He began to move with a new kind of precision, no longer weighed down by the illusion of trust in his staff, but fueled by the clarity of betrayal. He built new systems, tighter and leaner, relying only on what he could control. Every decision became a calculated strike, every move a test of his ability to stay ahead of those who sought his ruin. The alien girl remained at his side through it all, her silence more valuable than the noise of any advisor he had once employed. She became a lens through which he viewed the chaos, her calm presence sharpening his perception, reminding him when falsehoods glittered too brightly to be real. There were times when he felt her gaze on him steady and unwavering, as if she were measuring his resolve. He realized that in a world of shifting loyalties and treachery, her presence was the only constant he could not afford to lose. Yet even she could not shield him from the storm gathering around him. Each day brought new revelations of betrayal, new maneuvers by rivals, new subtle attacks meant to weaken him further. He was caught in a game where every piece moved against him, and the board itself seemed tilted in favor of his enemies. Still, he refused to bend. If the world wanted to see him broken, then he would force it to reckon with his defiance. He began to prepare countermeasures, strategies designed not only to defend but to strike back. He studied the moves of his rivals and traced the fingerprints of betrayal back to their sources, piecing together the network of thieves who had hollowed out his empire. The more he uncovered, the more he realized how deep the conspiracy ran. It was not merely one corporation or one government, but a coalition of interests, human and alien alike, united by the desire to dismantle what he had built and rebuild it for themselves. That realization should have filled him with despair, but instead it lit a fire in him. Because if they all wanted what was his, then they had already admitted his supremacy. They had not sought to create something new, they had sought to take what only he could build. That, he realized, was his greatest weapon. The pressure of rivals, corporations, and governments became not just obstacles but fuel for a new vision. His empire was no longer about wealth or power alone. It had become a test of humanity itself. If he could withstand the onslaught, if he could turn betrayal into resilience, then it would not just be his victory but humanity's as well. For the first time he understood why the alien girl had chosen him, why she had whispered her warning. This was never about protecting a single man or a single company. It was about preparing for the moment when humanity would be tested not from without but from within, and whether it had the strength to endure. And as he stood at the center of that storm, with enemies closing in from every side, he felt not fear but the grim certainty that he was the one meant to carry that burden, no matter how heavy it became.
The choice before him was not one he had ever expected to face. For years, his life had been guided by hard data, profit margins, and the cutthroat logic of survival in a corporate landscape where sentiment had no place. He had trusted numbers, contracts, and his own unyielding willpower, but never the word of another without proof. And yet now, in the wreckage of betrayal, he found himself forced to place his future, and perhaps more than his future, into the hands of someone who was not even human. The alien girl's warning had proven true in ways that shook him to the core, but trusting her further meant stepping into uncharted territory, relying not on facts and evidence, but on something far more fragile: faith. Faith in her strange ability to see through lies, in the possibility that she carried insight into dangers he could not yet perceive. It was a leap unlike any he had ever made, but as the walls closed in around him and the enemies within and without grew bolder, he realized it might also be the only path left. The alien girl had never asked him for trust. She had not sought power, had not demanded payment or position, had not leveraged her gift to manipulate him the way any human advisor might have. Instead, she had simply watched, her silence heavy with truths he could feel pressing at the edges of his perception. It was he who returned to her again and again, drawn not by her words but by the quiet certainty that she could see what others could not. When he questioned her, she answered little, but even in her vagueness there was a resonance that felt more real than the carefully crafted assurances of his former staff. Slowly, against every instinct that had once defined him, he began to shift his weight onto her presence, measuring his decisions not just by his own judgment but by the subtle cues of her reactions. It was not a partnership in the human sense, but something stranger, a reliance born out of necessity and tempered by the recognition that her perspective was unlike anything he had ever encountered. He could feel the stakes rising with every passing day. The sabotage of his empire had revealed weaknesses he could no longer ignore, but beyond the personal betrayal lay something larger, something he was only beginning to understand. The forces aligned against him were not simply trying to ruin one man's company, they were probing the strength of humanity itself. If they succeeded, if they dismantled the structures he had built and claimed them for their own, it would send a message across the stars. Humanity was vulnerable, its creations ripe for plunder, its ambitions easily crushed from within. The alien girl had not said as much in explicit words, but he could feel it in the way she watched him, the way her gaze lingered when reports of alien competitors surfaced on the feeds. This was no longer just his fight, it was humanity's fight, and his empire had become the battlefield on which it would be decided. Trusting her meant more than trusting a single warning. It meant reshaping his entire understanding of what leadership required. He had once believed that strength came from control, from bending others to his will, and leaving no room for weakness. But her presence had shown him another kind of strength, one rooted not in domination but in discernment, the ability to see what was real, to distinguish truth from the shadows cast by lies. It was a skill humanity did not yet possess, and perhaps that was why she had chosen him. If he could learn to trust that gift, to wield it wisely, then he could lead in a way no human had before. The thought unsettled him, but it also ignited something he had not felt in years: possibility. He began to test the limits of what trust in her could mean. Small decisions at first, choices about who to approach, which channels to open, which risks to take. Each time, he found her reactions a compass truer than any algorithm or advisor. When her gaze hardened, he pulled back, and when it softened, he pressed forward. The results were undeniable. Potential allies revealed themselves to be false friends before they could strike, while unlikely partnerships flourished in places he would never have thought to look. The alien girl never took credit, never spoke of what she had done, but he could see her quiet satisfaction when events unfolded as she had foreseen. Each success tightened the bond between them, binding his fate more closely to hers, and yet trust was never without its dangers. By depending on her, he opened himself to vulnerabilities unlike any he had faced before. If she betrayed him or if her abilities failed him, there would be no safety net, no second chance. The thought gnawed at him, but even as it did, he found himself unable to pull away. Perhaps it was the inevitability of it, the sense that he had already crossed the threshold the moment he chose to believe her first warning. Once he had accepted that, the rest followed naturally, and as much as it unsettled him, there was also a strange relief in it. For the first time in years, he did not have to carry the burden of suspicion alone. Someone else could see what he could not, and in that shared perception, he felt less isolated than he had in a lifetime. The alien girl never spoke of her own people, but in quiet moments he wondered about them. Did they live in a world where lies were impossible, where trust was not a fragile gamble, but a certainty woven into the fabric of existence? Did they understand humanity's endless games of deception as crude and exhausting? If so, then perhaps she saw something in him that mirrored her own people's expectations, a potential humanity had yet to reach. He did not ask her these questions, because he sensed the weight of exile in her silence, the pain of being separated from her kind. But he could not shake the thought that her presence here, at his side, was more than accident. Perhaps it was fate, or perhaps it was simply survival, but either way, it had changed the course of his life and perhaps the course of humanity's future. The storm of rivals, corporations, and governments did not abate, but as he leaned more fully into her guidance, he found himself less shaken by it. Each new attack became an opportunity to refine his resilience, each betrayal a lesson in the difference between appearance and reality. Together they began to weave a counter-strategy, not built on the old foundations of secrecy and control, but on the sharper, more dangerous edge of truth. He no longer relied on walls to keep his enemies out, but on her ability to expose them, to strip away the masks they wore. It was not infallible, but it was powerful, and for the first time since the purge, he began to feel the shape of victory within reach. The choice to trust her was not a single act but an ongoing surrender, a daily recalibration of what it meant to lead in a world where lies were as plentiful as stars. It demanded humility he had not known he possessed, and courage of a kind that did not show in boardrooms or balance sheets. It was the courage to admit that humanity could not yet face the universe alone, that survival might depend on listening to voices beyond its own, and in the quiet presence of the alien girl, he began to see that this was not weakness but strength, the kind of strength that might one day define humanity not as prey to be plundered, but as a force to be reckoned with. The final confrontation came not in a boardroom or battlefield, but in a silence so heavy it felt like the weight of the universe pressing down. His enemies had overplayed their hand, revealing the depth of their greed and the fragility of their alliances. In that moment, with the alien girl at his side, he saw the truth laid bare. Humanity was not weak, only untested, and he was the proof of its endurance. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed him had instead sharpened him into something stronger, a symbol that could not be stolen, a defiance that could not be broken,